The Far Eastern theater of the First World War is an often neglected theater. Now, to be fair, it wasn't anywhere near so important to the war's progression as, say, what was going on in Europe, or even maybe the Middle East. But for two nations in particular, it represented a dramatic shift in power, the likes of which few in the Western world had ever imagined before. It crushed forever Germany's hopes of establishing a global naval empire, the likes of which was intended to rival even the British Royal Navy. And it provided yet further growth to an ascendant imperial power in Japan, which, as a non-European empire, delivered Germany one of its earliest and most thorough defeats during the Great War. In particular, the Siege of Tsingtao was a small battle of immense importance. And in this video, we're going to talk about why that was, and of course, how the siege itself actually took place. Oh, and while we're speaking of ascendant powers, for this video I have joined up with Falcon's Fighter Tales to help tell the story. If you want to learn more about the air and naval elements of this campaign, as well as some of the controversies involving them, well then you'll find his amazing video linked down below. And so with that, let us begin with part the first, Germany's Eastern Aspirations. And also a lovely opportunity for a disclaimer that you should take all the pronunciations in this video with more salt than you would a succulent Chinese meal. In any case, Kiau-chau Bay is located in China's far north, opening out to the Yellow Sea right across from Korea. It's a strategically very important region, especially in the late Victorian era, as European investment into China is exploding in more ways than one. Germany acquired this bay and her 80,000 souls in 1897 under a 99-year lease after the so-called Juillet incident. The incident was basically the same old classic story of European imperialism. Local peasants kill some German missionaries in the area over purported abuses, and it's a delightful little convenience, a nice little excuse for Germany to roll up with a fleet and demand compensation for this horrible, tragic act and all that. It was actually something as a region and whatnot that the Germans had their eyes on for a while, something that they were actively looking for an excuse to do by that point. So really the fate of the missionaries is really quite convenient as far as German foreign policy is concerned. It's a very common Victorian-era story, unfortunately. So when Germany takes control of this relatively underdeveloped region, they declare that the little coastal village of Tsing-tao is going to be the focus of their brand new colony. Although it's worth noting that technically speaking, this wasn't actually a colony because, one, the land wasn't actually owned. It was only being leased by Germany from China for, again, 99 years. And then, of course, two, the entire region was explicitly under the control of the German Imperial Navy, not the civilian government. The entire settlement wasn't going to become like a traditional German city. It was basically going to be one big naval base from which the Kaiser's ships might resupply for voyages across the Pacific, supporting yet further colonial ambitions, of course, and providing a check to the British in the region as well. So it's no wonder, then, that this acquisition fueled a mini scramble in the area, with the British soon after snapping up Port Edward, the French were taking Fort Bayard, and even the Russians managed to slide in to claim Port Arthur, all through their own various treaties and leasings and whatnot, with an increasingly Swissified the cheese, not the mountains, Swiss cheese, the whole, the China's getting pulled apart. Swissified China. It's a joke. You get the idea. The Germans immediately started investing heavily into their new possession, expanding the harbor, widening the roads, electrifying the area, and constructing modern housing for German workers and officials, while, of course, providing them with all the modern comforts of a sewage system, schools, banks, hospitals, a post office, and, most important of all, a railway network. In 1910, that railway was even connected through China to the Trans-Siberian Railway, which would allow travel to the naval base all the way from Berlin without ever actually touching the water. Volume 1 of The Great World War, published in 1915, funnily enough, estimates that Germany spent nearly £900,000 on these developments in 1913 alone, and over £20 million overall. If we only account for the inflation rate, that amounts to over 3 billion euros today. Now, there's a lot more, to be fair, that goes into the comparison of historical currency values than just the inflation rates. You can't really get the full picture just with that one figure, but suffice to say, they spent an awful lot of money on this place. And the result of this establishment was that in 1912 alone, Tsingtao would furnish nearly £3 million in exports and over £4 million in imports. Although, as well, speaking to Germany's need to expand her presence in the wider region, only about a third of that trade was with Germany itself. So, while this is a very, very important location, not only militarily but economically, it wasn't only important to the Germans, if that makes sense. Tsingtao was to be the citadel from which the German Navy could support her rapidly expanding empire in Asia. It was militarily, economically, and perhaps most important of all, symbolically vital to the fairly new nation's global ambitions, and especially to the dreams of the Kaiser himself, who was so preoccupied with matching the power of the Royal Navy. So when the war broke out in Europe and Wilhelm II received a Japanese ultimatum to quit the region entirely, well, it should come as no surprise that he refused, ordering the naval base to hold out at any cost, reportedly saying, "It would shame me more to surrender Kiau-chau to the Japanese than Berlin to the Russians." And so, as the lamps were going out all over Europe, the Imperial Japanese Navy would steam to China and began landing its troops. The stage was set for a sponsored segment. Yes, for a sponsored segment. This video is sponsored by Exter. Everyone, I'm in a little bit of a predicament. As you're aware, this video has been sponsored by Exter. Hey, fantastic, good quality wallet. I use mine every day. It's great, it's great. Why would that be a problem? Because I've reached a stage, I've been working with Exter for a long time, and I think I've reached a stage in my relationship with them that I have to blatantly tell you to please stop buying Exter wallets. Hold on, Brandon, why do you want us to stop? You just said it's a good product to use it every day. I do, I like it. I actually genuinely can recommend the product. But here's the thing, is the more Exter wallets you all buy, the more successful this sponsorship relationship is, the more hecking wallets that Exter sends me. Oh, or of course we have it in brown. It's 2. We have it in another brown. We have it in the darker brown. And then, of course, we mustn't forget the nice, fancy textured version of it all as well. So that's nothing. We can handle 5 wallets. Well, what about the card carriers? 5, 6, 7 card carriers, all different colors, too. We have blue. We got, like darker blue, sort of like almost purpley kind of shade. There's browns and purples. Oh, look, I even have another card carrier attached to that wallet because why not? And you know how one of the big pushes of all this stuff, be it the more, traditional wallets or the narrow card carrier style, one of the big things is, it's so much better than a bifold. It's so sleek and modern and fancy. Ooh, look at that. You don't have a flippin', where's my proper wallet? There we go, the real cards. You don't have that quick card access button with a flipping bifold. No, you don't. That's one of the biggest pluses, advantages of this product, right? But here's the thing, maybe you don't like any of that. Maybe you still like the classic bifold, so they sent me a classic bifold too. And you know that horrible moment where, you feel like you may have lost your wallet somewhere, you may have forgotten it at the store. Is it there? I don't know. Yeah, well, I don't have to worry about experiencing that moment at any point because of Exter's, well, obviously they have the GPS tracking card. It's solar powered on the top there, as you can see, so you don't have to replace any batteries or anything. And then you just track your own wallet via a nice little convenient, cozy little app. Yeah, no, fantastic. Great. These little cards, great little invention, great little creation. I have 3 of them. And the thing that makes it the worst of all is that I am contractually obligated to inform you, of course, That extra now has a new sale going on. When you use my discount code BrandonF, you get up to 50% off the order now. So, 50% off extra wallets, BrandonF, link in the description down below. Get them for your friends, get them for your family. I know that I sure am.
Thank you to Exter for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the topic at hand.
But also, okay, real talk, joke for the ad, but Extra, actually, if you do want to send me more wallets, that's totally fine, because I actually do like them, and Christmas is actually going to be really easy for me this year, because I have all these extra wallets, yeah. Unfortunately for the garrison of Tsingtao, when war was declared, most of the German East Asian Squadron was far afield in the Pacific, positioning to fight the British. And now, to learn more about what the Germans did have, most notably the Austrian ship Kaiserin Elisabeth, check out Falcon's video right after this one. But otherwise, the city itself was in a pretty great position, and it was well defended. It was on a peninsula, headed with numerous large hills called Moltke Hill, Bismarck Hill, and Iltis Hill, which had long been fortified with heavy artillery, machine guns, and soon enough, with trench networks as well. Further afield, the peninsula is also partially crossed by a series of rivers, which would serve to impede enemy movements, and with the declaration of war, the garrison immediately set to constructing new batteries and additional redoubts all across the line. The harbor was also heavily mined against potential enemy incursions. It sounds like a tough nut to crack then, and in some ways it was. But the German garrison also faced a series of problems. For starters, ironically enough, it's sort of taking a page out of Germany's playbook here, those mines did very little to stop the Japanese landings, which actually took place a few miles to the east on neutral Chinese territory. Now, the Chinese naturally protested this, especially as their civilians suffered great abuses at the hands of the Japanese troops. Shockingly enough, I know. Ultimately, though, at the end of the day, they were powerless to stop the over 20,000 strong Japanese army, which also brought with it over 100 guns. And after all, they are just marching through. Meanwhile, the German garrison, despite their excellent defensive network, simply didn't have the numbers to actually man it. At best, they could only muster just under 4,000 men, mostly Marines and sailors, with some soldiers and a handful of Chinese levies. A lot of their equipment as well wasn't really the best, with many of their much boasted cannon being outdated, including many of them that were earlier taken as prizes from China during the Boxer Rebellion, and even some guns from France that were taken as prizes after the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. The situation was bad enough that, realizing pretty early on that a naval breakout was nigh impossible, the Germans actually began removing the guns from some of their larger ships, the Kaiserin Elisabeth, for example, and moving them inland instead. On top of it all, the garrison also didn't have much in the way of ammunition, as soon enough you'll see, they would be burning through that stuff pretty quickly. It's worth noting that the Japanese weren't alone in this expedition either. They were, of course, one of the Allied powers, which is how they got involved with the war to start with. So from the onset, the British Royal Navy had dispatched a few ships that were already in the area to aid the Japanese squadron, and later some 1,500 British Empire soldiers would arrive as well. These were men of the 36th Sikh Regiment and the 2nd Battalion South Wales Borderers. Now, overall, these troops didn't really do all that much because, of course, comparatively there were very few of them, but they were still involved in a few of the attacks. But their primary purpose there was really to keep tabs on their allies, and that presence wasn't without tension with the Japanese. Friendly fire incidents were all too common. Lance Corporal Thomas of the SWB was the first man in his battalion to die in that war, not by the Germans, but by a Japanese soldier who mistook him for one. The colonial uniforms of the European powers were similar enough, I suppose, that the Japanese often had difficulties in differentiating between them. Because of this, the British troops began wearing white cloth on their helmets to identify themselves, and later on, some of them were even issued with Japanese-style smocks to wear over their uniforms. The British were also pretty ill-prepared for this campaign, with their men mostly wearing summer uniforms with cotton shirts and shorts, with only a rain cape and a blanket to protect against the harsh Chinese rainy season. They also only had a single officer who was actually capable of speaking Japanese to act as an interpreter, so communication wasn't exactly the best. In fact, as a part of the effort overall to smooth over relations between these two sides, at one point an aide from the emperor himself was dispatched to bring those British Empire troops a gift of sake for the officers and cigarettes for the men. Even if they don't speak Japanese, I'm sure that was something of a common language between the two sides. Action was opened on the 2nd of September 1914, when the German gunboat Jaguar located and sank an isolated Japanese destroyer, the Shiratai. An opening success for Germany, although not many of them would follow. By the 5th, the Japanese are launching air missions over Tsingtao, realizing just how weak the German position is with very few ships and even dropping a few bombs on them. And to resist those sorties, the Germans only had a single plane and a single pilot. Again, if you want to learn more about those air operations, Falcon's video is linked down below. This battle is actually really important in the history of air combat, and those aerial actions, while not, directly changing the fate of the battle, they're still a very important part of the overall story. So again, when you're done here, I would recommend you go and watch Falcon's video to get that complete picture. Now, in any case, by September 13th or 14th or thereabouts, the Japanese cavalry had reached the city and was quickly able to seize the railway junctions and other vital posts that are just outside with fairly little resistance from the overwhelmed defenders. Having thus then cut off the city from both land and by sea, sort of by air as well, as applicable as that is in this time period. Having done so, the Japanese waste no times with complicated siege networks, but realizing that their enemy is already wounded and fairly weak, they throw themselves into the attack. And so we come to part the third, Prinz Heinrich Hill. As the Japanese advance, German forces offer little resistance. They simply don't have the numbers to occupy the defenses that were further afield, and they pull most of their forces back to their defensive lines. There's one gap in their defensive works, however, one position that they simply could not afford to lose. The German defense would center around a mountain of significant height to the city's east, large enough that if the Japanese managed to take the hill and get their heavy artillery up its slopes, then they could bombard all three German forts at Moltke, Bismarck, and Iltis all at once, while suffering little repercussion. The fate of Tsingtao would depend on Prinz Heinrich Hill. And the Japanese knew it, too. Not seeking to lose their momentum, they quickly resolved to take the position and attacked on the 27th of September. As recorded in the book Battle Sketches, published in 1915, German artillery opened a terrific cannonade upon the Japanese lines, while 3 warships shelled the attacking right wing from the bay. The German fire was heavy and accurate. Japanese warships and aeroplanes, and also the British battleship Triumph, however, created a diversion that relieved the assaulting forces. 2 of the forts were shelled from the sea and suffered serious injury. For many hours, the great guns, thundering their challenges from sea and land and estuary, maintained continual uproar. Darkness began to gather. Fighting continued into the night, and early next morning was renewed. But the defenders seemed to lack enthusiasm. It is doubtful indeed whether their forces were sufficiently numerous to hold with strength their advanced positions. After the fact, the commanding German general Alfred Meyer-Waldeck would recount to an American observer he met, "I thought the Japanese casualties would be very heavy, as they fought bravely and charged desperately, and I estimated their loss at 5,000 to 6,000. I have been astonished to learn that the loss in killed and wounded amounts to only 1,700. They certainly showed remarkable skill in taking cover." The second day of the assault, on the 28th, the Germans had no choice but to fall back, and the Japanese, with their British and Indian allies, took the position. With the heights captured, the fate of the city seemed all but assured. Again, as written in Battle Sketches, the beleaguered town, visible from the height, was now face to face with siege. German officers who knew all the points, weak and strong, of the defenses could not but realize their inability to withstand the siege guns which Japan would sooner or later bring to the attack. And so we come to the final stage of siege, and part the 4th, the thunder of the Emperor's guns. The heaviest Japanese artillery was well behind their forward units. It would take over a month for them to bring the massive siege guns over northern China's broken roads and rough country to the front and be able to actually establish them on Prinz Heinrich Hill. So after a rapid moving campaign, which saw the Japanese make great progress in really just a few days, now basically all of October was going to pass relatively slowly, with both sides digging in deeper and deeper, skirmishing with each other, and the Germans pummeling the Japanese with as much artillery fire as they could before their own guns were in place. In fact, the German fire was so intense, sending out on average between 1,000 and 1,500 shells every day, that many observers actually felt that the Germans may have been purposefully throwing away their ammunition. Now, I found that same sentiment, that they were just firing as quickly as they could without regard to proper aiming and the like, I found that sentiment repeated in a lot of primary sources that were published at least from around the war itself or shortly afterwards. After all, this is at least the logic that they were going by, everybody knew how important this post was, strategically and ideologically both, for Germany. But the garrison knew as well that it was basically hopeless. They were not going to hold out for like the half a year that they were being expected to by, by the German high commands and such. So what better way to make it look like you had a glorious, desperate last stand than by fighting until you literally ran out of ammunition? And who could possibly blame the garrison for surrendering when they literally had no more shells to actually fire? Now, although, as you may expect, the Germans denied that that was their approach, and I don't think that there's any particularly compelling reason to believe that it was the case. After all, why bother reserving your ammunition if you also know that a protracted siege is going to be a loss anyway? If you know you're not going to be able to hold out for a protracted siege, you may as well use all the ammunition right off the bat in the hopes that you can do some damage. And that's basically as well what the Germans said that they did. After the battle, the same American observer that I quoted earlier, a certain Mr. Jeffrey Jones, spoke with a German officer that he'd met at a hotel after the siege. And he explained, the officer did, to Jones that the garrison had held out far longer than any of them had ever even anticipated, and let's say that they held out for all that long, and that the reason why they went through their ammunition so quickly, it wasn't to waste shells, but solely to do as much damage to the Japanese as possible before the assault on the fortifications could be made. We regulated our fire with the one purpose of covering the country with shells before they had a chance to get under cover, and that we were attempting solely to postpone the fall of Tsingtao as much as possible by hindering the Allied forces in their work. Although, for one reason or another, it's also worth noting that the German barrages were largely ineffectual, and they did little to achieve these ends. The Japanese would expand and advance their siege works, not surprisingly in the form of a vast trench network, under the German fire largely unimpeded. As the writing on the rubble became increasingly clear, the Germans made one final attempt to break out at sea, but they failed. And in response, they scuttled most of their now useless ships to ensure that they wouldn't fall into enemy hands. When the Japanese finally finished getting their guns into position, they amounted to over 150 pieces, including large 28-centimeter howitzers and even naval guns. The bombardment of Tsingtao had been arranged to begin in celebration of the birthday of the Mikado. The shelling was timed to start in royal salute at dawn. Men who, stationed upon Heinrich Hill, could look down upon the doomed town athwart the narrowing peninsula, with the sea studded with gray warships surrounding, had before them a wonderful spectacle as the morning sun, rising from the Pacific, slowly dispersed the darkness. The thunder of the great guns broke suddenly upon that stillness which only dawn knows, and their discharges flashed redly on the darkling slopes. The three German forts attempted to maintain some counter-battery fire, but they were outranged, outpositioned, and outgunned. Before too long, on the 6th of November, they had all but run out of ammunition, and it was on that day that the Japanese finally resolved to force the remaining German strongpoints. they attacked the forts. The assault had been preceded by a terrific bombardment of the German forts by the Allied warships, and though the defenders made desperate efforts to repair the work of destruction, they were unable to make the slightest headway against the remorseless hail of Anglo-Japanese shells. After the forts on the first line of defense were carried at the point of the bayonet in the early hours of November 6th, and other forces had been seen by the garrison advancing to carry the remaining batteries, white flags were hoisted at 6 a.m. By the morning of November 7th, the Germans had requested terms for surrender. Their fortifications had become, in the words of Jefferson Jones, a mass of shale and twisted steel rods, thoroughly destroyed. Although now some part of that destruction was at the Germans' own hands as well. Rather than surrendering their many guns to the enemy, they had destroyed them and any other potential prizes with dynamite and nitroglycerin. The garrison would also raid their own storehouses, opening up cans and dumping out great heaps of corned beef and sausages and milk and other, German foods. They destroyed or otherwise removed all of their maps, all their orders, any sort of government documents. They even resorted to burning all of the stamps in their post office. Jones would continue to say that the German garrison left little that the Japanese could boast about except the city of Tsing-tao itself. And so, at long last, this brings us to the aftermath of Tsing-tao and to our final part, the fifth, the rising sun and the Union Jack. By the siege's end, it was not merely the city's fortifications which had suffered. Modern long-range heavy artillery had wrought its havoc on the great citadel of German imperial aspirations. As Jones walked through its ruined streets, he would muse how the city appeared as if a typhoon had passed through it. Its wide asphalt and macadamized streets, fronted by beautiful 4- and 5-story buildings of German architecture, were vacant. Giant shells, some 3 feet long and a foot in diameter, were lying about on the sidewalk and streets, still unexploded. Trees, splintered at their bases, lay toppled over in the avenues. Windows in the houses were shattered. White, gaunt holes in the sides of buildings where shells had torn their way made the residence blocks appear to be gasping for air. Such was Tsing-tao when I first saw it 2 days after its surrender. But for the continual sight of the rising sun flag flapping from every peak in the rear of the city, as well as from every government building and its message of occupied, one would have thought Tsing-tao a city deserted. International praise was quick to come from Japan's many allies, and particularly, of course, the British. Arthur Balfour would write, "Everybody must sympathize with the feelings of the Japanese, who have shown all that courage, enterprise, and organization which have always distinguished them. Everybody must sympathize with them when they have learned that the great fortress erected by those who so flouted them in 1897 has fallen to their arms, never again to return to those who built it. Our allies in the Far East are the first among us who have reached conclusively and finally the objective for which they strove." And Lord Kitchener, upon hearing the news, would write the Japanese Minister of War, saying, "Please accept my warmest congratulations on the success of the operations against Tsing-tao. Will you be so kind as to express my felicitations to the Japanese forces engaged? The British Army is proud to have been associated with their gallant comrades in this enterprise." Likewise, many Japanese officials would praise the British and their other allies as well. Tokyo's mayor, Baron Sakatani, would offer King George the most respectful congratulations of the Tokyo City Council on the fall of Tsing-tao and heartfelt thanks for the brilliant action of your Majesty's Army and Navy in this famous siege. Even the Emperor himself would convey a message, if not perhaps directly, then through an aide, saying, "His Majesty the Emperor deeply appreciates the brilliant deeds by the British Army and Navy, who in cooperation with the Imperial Army and Navy against Tsing-tao fought bravely and achieved the object of the war." Lantern processions and other parades were held in front of the Emperor's palace and Allied embassies. Japanese newspapers read headlines like, "The impregnable fortress which Germany has been 19 years carefully erecting is reduced by 8 days' severe bombardment," and "All Japan unites in enthusiastic jubilation over the grand achievement of her army and navy." One paper would describe how, after news of the victory broke, the city awoke amid the brilliant colors of the sun-rayed flags and Union Jacks along the houses and streetcars, flapping brilliantly in the brisk autumn breeze. it was kind of a big deal, and not just to the victors either. The Germans were pretty bitter about the loss, as you may imagine, from what we covered in the video's first chapter, and also given that this was a defeat inflicted by a non-European power, instigated, as they saw it, by none other than perfidious Albion itself. There's a lot of moral, psychological, racialist, there's a lot of weight behind something like that happening in 1914. As one German newspaper, Lokalanzeiger, would write, "Woe to you, Nippon! We shall never forget the brutal attack of the Yellow Bandits, nor the Britons who instigated them. Our mills will grind slowly, but even though years should pass before our turn comes at last, then throughout Germany shall resound a shout of joy. Woe to you, Nippon." Yet despite all of the tension and the enthusiasm surrounding this victory in the East, the Japanese military itself didn't immediately occupy the city. German officers were permitted to retain their swords, and they kept their freedom of the city for the most part as well. When the garrison was taken prisoner, they were treated fairly well. There were no victory parades, and there was certainly no sacking of the settlement either. And Allied forces only actually entered the city a little over a week after its fall. Now, before that point, Japanese, staff officers, they were allowed to enter the city, but their men were expressly forbidden to. This was all to keep order in the town and ensure that the transition of control went over as smoothly as possible, basically like letting the conquered peoples sort of pick themselves back up, start cleaning off, and get used to the idea before they look outside and see parading Japanese soldiers. Now, the Japanese would keep the city after the war, one of Germany's many punishments in the Treaty of Versailles, but they would only hold the city until the early 1920s, when things in China started getting kind of crazy. Again, that's a whole other story. But with that, I do believe that it is time we came to our conclusion. The Siege of Tsingtao lasted from the 27th of August to the 7th of November 1914, a total of 2 months and 11 days. It was the only major land battle in the Far Eastern theater of the First World War, and the first time that Japanese and German soldiers ever fought against each other. And while, when you compare it to campaigns like, say, the Somme or Verdun or something like that, it may seem like an incredibly tiny, even an insignificant footnote in the history of the Great War, for those who took part in it, it was an incredibly momentous and even meaningful event. For Japan, it was yet another victory that helped solidify their presence as a great, even imperial power. A non-white nation capable of rivaling the great European empires. And finally, after being thwarted of their desires in the earlier Russo-Japanese War, it represented a solid strategic victory upon which they could continue to expand their military and economic influence in China. And we all know how that went. And for Germany, it was a crushing defeat, perhaps even symbolizing that which was to come as a result of the war. It was the loss of a colonial gem, the focus of their empire in the Far East, the base which was meant to help them become a worldwide naval power. Only the defeat of the Kaiser's navy at Jutland would perhaps represent a greater blow to Germany's aspirations. By the end of it all, this is only a small portion of the wider, fascinating story. And as ever, if you'd like to learn more, then you're going to find all sorts of fascinating sources, as well as additional reading listed in the description. And of course, if you'd like to watch an amazing video, again, all about the air campaign and about some of the ships and whatnot that are surrounding this battle, how significant it was to military aviation history, well then, Falcon's contribution to this mini collaboration is also linked down below. I strongly recommend it. Great video, great channel, like I said, a bit of an ascendant power on YouTube. Mark my words on that one. But otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I know it's a little bit different from the usual content, but I'm trying to broaden the horizons a little bit, different nations, different places, different time periods, and all that. As usual, of course, if you did enjoy it and you're interested in supporting my content, well, none of it would be possible without the amazing individuals who support me on Patreon and on Ko-Fi through YouTube Super Thanks, and now via YouTube memberships as well. And even ultimately, if you cannot provide that form of direct support, well then, a like and a comment, and again, your time, your viewership, it all goes a very long way, and it is very much appreciated. Thank you for the time you spent with me today, and until the next time, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.